Hi, this is a class on reincarnation. Before we get into talking about reincarnation, though, I do want to mention that recent polls have said that 25% of Americans believe in reincarnation. And incredibly, 20% of Christians believe in some form of reincarnation. Reincarnation actually started in India. It's part of the Hindu religion, which started around 800 BC. So that is probably one of the oldest religions in the world. We need to get a few definitions out of the way first so we can be sure what we're talking about. Carne is a Latin word that means meat or flesh. So when you hear chili con carne, that's chili with meat. When you hear the word incarnation, as in the incarnation of Jesus, that means to be infleshed. So before Jesus was conceived, he was up in heaven. He is God. He is the second person of the Trinity, or God the Son. When he became incarnated into Mary's womb, he actually took on flesh. That's why we call it the incarnation. The word reincarnation means to re-enter the flesh. So a definition of reincarnation is the belief that after death, while the body goes in the grave, the soul passes to another body through rebirth. And then usually after that person is born and they die, the soul then goes to another body, and there's a big cycle. The word karma means action or deed. So karma is really a scorecard of all of your actions or deeds done in all of your lives. Somehow, and they don't really explain this, it's assumed that you start out with negative karma or a karmic debt. They don't explain how that happens. You just do. So in one life, if your good deeds outweigh your bad deeds, the difference then is applied to this karmic debt or your bad karma that you started out with. And over many lives, if you have more good deeds than bad deeds, you're working off that karmic debt until you finally get it to zero, in which case you escape the system of reincarnation or the system of rebirths. And we'll talk a little more about that later. But if your good deeds outweigh your bad deeds in a particular life, then you are born into a more pleasant womb. If your bad deeds outweigh your good deeds in that life, you're born into not as pleasant of a womb. Now again, there are many different forms of reincarnation. There's a human form, and that's pretty much what we're going to be talking about. But there's also the animal form. You can be born into animals. There's also a vegetable form or a mineral form that kind of incorporates all of these things together. The animal form is one reason why the cow is considered sacred in the Hindu religion. It's why they don't eat beef, because you could be eating Aunt Mary. So, but we're pretty much going to stick to the human form of reincarnation. Samsara is this cycle of rebirth. Is it the same as reincarnation? Yeah, pretty much. It's what we mean by reincarnation, but samsara is the cycle of rebirth. When you're released from that cycle, when all of your karmic debt is paid off and you're released or you escape from the cycle, that is called moksha. And we'll get into that, and we'll get into what you are released what you're released to, what happens after you experience moksha. So once you pay off, as you're paying off this karmic debt, as you're going from life to life, and hopefully if your good deeds outweigh your bad deeds, you will eventually get to zero karmic debt, and then you will experience moksha. You'll be released from this cycle of rebirth. Now, in in Hinduism, you have thousands or even millions of gods. Hinduism is pantheistic. They believe in many gods. But it all comes down to one God who's over all these other gods. That God is named Brahma, and it's spelled B-R-A-H-M-A. Brahma is often depicted as a woman. Sometimes Brahma is depicted as a man. Sometimes Brahma is depicted as kind of androgynous, kind of a combination of a man and a woman. Sometimes it's depicted as something, neither a man or woman. Technically, Brahma is neither a man or a woman, it's an it. And there is no morality attached to Brahma. Now, I know that's hard for Christians to understand because the Christian God definitely has concepts of good and evil. That doesn't really exist in Hinduism per se. But we'll get into that later as to what's good karma and what's bad karma, because obviously they have to have some system of determining what's good and what's bad. There is a Christianized form of reincarnation, and I use the term Christianized extremely loosely. In fact, let me go back. In Figure 1, the Hindu reincarnation model I have here, and then right next to it I have the Christianized model. And just to let you know, the Christianized model says if you don't accept Jesus in this life, hey, you get another life to accept him. What happens if you don't accept him in that life? Well, you get another life. You get as many lives as you need until you finally accept Jesus as your Savior. What this really amounts to is everybody gets saved in the end. Everybody goes to heaven. We call that universalism or universal salvation. It is not a Christian position. But like I say, there are some people who call themselves Christians who believe in reincarnation, and this is how they explain it. So you'll want to take a look at figures 1 and 2 for both the Hindu concept of reincarnation and then the Christianized view of it. Now that we've gotten the definitions out of the way, what's appealing about reincarnation? One of the things about Americans is we love to import other things to America, but while we import the whole thing, we really emphasize the positive things. We kind of downplay the negative things. So let's take a look at those positive things first. The first thing is reincarnation entirely removes the possibility of eternal punishment. If you go through enough lives, you will eventually be absorbed into God. In other words, there really is no hell. So that's a positive thing for many people. We'll look at some of the negatives in a few minutes, but that's a positive thing. Another thing is it produces a real fascination with past lives. With people saying, ooh, I wonder who I was in a past life who was famous. Okay. Past lives are only recalled sometimes under hypnosis. And some hypnotist, as a way of scientifically justifying the benefits of hypnosis and of reincarnation, of past lives. If a person has a fear of something, let's say a fear of flying, under hypnosis, if they go into their past lives, they can maybe determine the cause of some of a person's phobias, or they may determine why a person is afraid of, let's say, flying. And theoretically, they could deal with that. We'll get into that in a few minutes. That has not been proven at all, but it is a positive. A third thing is that suffering in this life is not God's fault, and it's not your fault. It's because you did something in a previous life, and now you're just getting payback. But it's nothing you did in this life, or it's not God's fault. It's something you did in a past life. Again, some people think, hey, that's a real positive. Okay. Now let's put on our critical thinking caps. Let's take a look at some of these things, and I think we're going to find out what's really wrong with reincarnation. The first thing is, what moral standard determines what's good karma and what's bad karma? Because Hinduism is pantheistic, there really is no, yes, this is right, no, this is wrong. It just depends on what Hindu guru or Hindu teacher you're listening to. One Hindu guru may say, this is right. Another one may say, no, that's not right. It's wrong. That's what we call relative morality. And relative morality is really unlivable. You can't say what somebody else is doing is right or wrong. You can just say that it's right or wrong for you. Ultimately, nothing is good or bad. It's, and that's a real problem for reincarnationists, because their own system is self-defeating. So in the end, if karma doesn't tell you what's right or wrong, but it punishes you for doing wrong. So really, reincarnation is a system of retribution only. Again, when I say relative morality, and this applies to not just reincarnation, but any moral system, relative morality is really unlivable. When people say, you shouldn't judge me by your morals, what they're really saying is, you should judge me by my morals. So they have an absolute morality, make no mistake about it. It's just not the Bible's absolute morality. Okay, let's take a look at this thing about this fascination with past lives. Yeah, it's probably kind of interesting to say, who was I that was famous in a past life? But ultimately, this fascination does nothing to make us better people. Long and short of it, really doesn't. Also, there's nothing scientific about it. Hypnosis is not very accurate at all. As an example, a generation ago, when people started using hypnosis on sexual abuse victims, specifically on sexual abuse children, when the kids started having memories of this sexual abuse, they labeled it repressed memory syndrome. And for a while it was quite fashionable, until they started realizing that some of these weren't really repressed memories at all. They were false memories. And they found this out because under hypnosis, people are very susceptible to suggestion, especially young children. And many people in the courts started saying, we're not going to take this as as legitimate testimony because it's been proven to be false in the past. So they no longer call it repressed memory syndrome, they call it false memory syndrome, and pretty much the courts just won't allow it because first off, there's no way of proving it. Secondly, it has been, in many cases, has been proven to be false memories. It's just suggestion, the power of suggestion. So the fascination with past lives really doesn't help us any, and in some cases it can hurt people. Also, in relation to the problem of suffering or evil, reincarnationists will say, hey, if your 4-year-old baby is dying, it's because something he did in a past life. He's just getting payback for it now. That doesn't deal with the problem of evil or suffering. It just dismisses it by blaming it on a past life. And really, when it comes down to it, is it really fair for karma or God or whoever to punish children for the sins of a past life, especially when they can't remember that life, at least consciously? So that's not, it doesn't do anything to the problem of suffering or evil. It just punts it to a past life. Also, another problem with reincarnation is it doesn't guarantee spiritual progress. You don't know if you're making progress to paying down your karmic debt or if you're just increasing your karmic debt, because you don't know if your good deeds outweigh your bad deeds. In fact, it's hard to determine what's a good deed and what's a bad deed. So no matter how many lives you take on, you don't know if you're going deeper in debt or if you're digging yourself out. You won't know until you're released from this cycle, which is at the very end of the cycle. So you don't know if you got 100 lives to go through or 1,000 lives to go through. Another problem is reincarnation doesn't deal with the problem of evil. Somehow we got saddled with all of this bad karma or negative karma. We don't know how that happened. Some people will say, well, it's from a previous life. Okay, but then what happened in that previous life? How did you get saddled with it? Well, that's a previous life. Okay, the problem with that is you can't keep going back to a previous life. Somewhere you gotta start. Mathematicians call that going backwards infinite regression. And infinite regression doesn't work in the real world. It works as a mathematical concept, but it doesn't work in the real world. You can take time for an example. A lot of people don't realize this, but you can't keep going back infinitely in the past because time started with the creation of the universe. So it did have a starting point. And actually, an interesting argument to that is that we could never reach today if time was infinitely in the past, because we would never reach today because time is infinitely in the past. So, but that's another thing. Another problem with reincarnation is ultimately it's anti-humanitarian. There's no mercy here. There's no grace. There's no forgiveness. If you do something wrong in this life, there really is no forgiveness for it ultimately. It just counts as either bad karma. Well, it counts as bad karma, and you can't do anything to erase that from your record. Specifically helping crippled people or poor people or sick people, that can be considered wrong. Now, you may laugh at that, but I have an actual example of this. There is an orphanage in India, and it's a Christian orphanage, and they take in, as much as they can afford to, kids who are left on the street. Sometimes parents have too many kids, and they don't want them to live a life of poverty, so sometimes they will actually ask this orphanage, hey, can you take our kid in, because we know you feed and clothe them, and we can't afford to do that. So they have, at the time that I read about this, they had 2,100 kids in their orphanage. When a local government was elected that was staunchly Hinduistic, they actually told this orphanage, this Christian orphanage, stop doing this. These kids are born into poverty because of what they did in a previous life, and you are messing with the law of karma. And by your helping them, that karma will then be applied, instead of to that person, to us as a region. So you're messing with the law of karma. You're making life a lot worse for the rest of us. They actually encircled this large orphanage, and they wanted to arrest the Christian pastor and his son that started it. And the pastor and his son actually had to go underground. It took about a year of being underground, so to speak, and finally the national government stepped in and said, hey, this orphanage they're educating kids, they're giving them food, clothing, they're making them productive adults, so the local region, knock it off, or we will come in and force you to knock it off. And they finally did. But again, according to some Hindus, a fairly significant number, helping poor or crippled or homeless or sick people, that's wrong, because you're working against the law of karma. Also, another thing is a society that believes in reincarnation will never produce a Mother Teresa or a Martin Luther King Jr. Why? Those are social reformers. They want to take a bad situation and make it better, and that's working against the law of karma. That's why you don't have Hindus who really want to make a person's life better. Also, people who have grown up with this worldview, they consider it a burden. My youngest son, and my wife, several years ago actually went to this Christian orphanage to help them. They went as a group from our church, and when they were on the train on the way there, my teenage son engaged a Hindi man in conversation, and he was talking with him about Hinduism, and he was very much surprised to find that, yes, they believe in reincarnation, they just believe it's reality, but he said, we don't view it as this really fun thing. He said, it's a burden to us. So a lot of people don't realize that when you've grown up with that, you view it as a burden, not a blessing. So also look at what this worldview produces. Look at India. It produces a hopeless, pessimistic view of life. People see their lives as dreary, endless cycles of reincarnation, never knowing when they're going to get out of it. Until the British came and conquered India, life was, as we know it, as we would determine it now, life was pretty bad in India, and it had no impetus to get better. It was only when the British came and introduced Christianity, and even then not a lot of Indians became Christians, partly probably because of how the British treated them,